Wonderful. I'm Dr. A. Simpson. I'm an associate of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, specifically associated with the intersection of Hinduism and contemporary society project. This is a project that's concerned with better understanding Hindus and their communities, their traditions, and specifically in relation to navigating contemporary society. There are tensions that relate to living and working in societies with values that may not be well aligned with those of the cultural or religious tradition associated with Hindu practices, and issues related to identity, values, affiliation, and so on. And connected with that project, which involves research, it involves a conference that's been previously organized. We have this invited speaker series, which aims to provide a forum for scholars to present, to discuss, share research related to the experience of contemporary Hindu communities and their intersections with host communities as well. And so this is the fourth invited speaker series. Today, our speaker is Dr. Angela Burt. She is a lecturer at the Australian Catholic University, where she teaches religious studies and sociology of religion as well. And her research has focused on the early history of the Hare Krishna movement. She's been involved with the Oral History Project since its very beginning in 2003. This was documenting the experiences of members of the Krishna community. She did research, interview research with members and former members from the United States to Canada to Europe, India, Australia, New Zealand. And then she has publications, two of them, which are most pertinent in-depth studies. One is Hare Krishna in the 21st Century, and that's in the Cambridge University Press Elements in New Religion series. And that's what will be the basis for her presentation today. She also has another book, Leading the Hare Krishna Movement, The Crisis of Succession in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, where she's analyzed the zonal Acharya period in ISKCON in the shortly after the departure of the movement's founder, Bhaktivedanta Swami, and that was published. That's a book that will be published by Routledge in 2024. So in terms of our schedule today, Dr. Burt will speak for about 25 minutes, and then this will leave around 25 minutes for questions, conversation as well. And then we'll have another 5 minutes to round out. Any questions that you have, please type them into the chat. And we will try to get through them all, but we may need to summarize if there are some questions that are similar. We might need to be a little selective. And please also note that this session is also being recorded. We share these series on our web page with the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. So without further ado, then please welcome our invited speaker, Dr. Angela Burt.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. All right, so yeah, I'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. So if there are any comments or questions that come up for you, feel free to send that in the chat and we'll address those at the end. So as Ace just said, I'll be talking about my book that's just been published in the Cambridge Elements New Religious Movements series, Hare Krishna in the 21st Century. And I'll just be talking about some key highlights from that today, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about in that book. So first of all, I'd just like to make some acknowledgements. First of all, I'd just like to thank Burke Rochford, who I believe is here today, for putting my name forward for working on this work. He was invited by Jim Lewis, and then invited me to take part in it as well. And then it turned out I ended up working on it on my own, but I'd just like to acknowledge Burke for the theoretical frameworks that are in the book. Those just need to give credit where credit is due, that those are, that was his idea. And of course, I'd like to thank Jim Lewis, the series editor, the late Jim Lewis. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, but I'd like to thank him for giving me the opportunity for working on this, and also my series editor, who I believe is coming today, maybe a little bit late, Rebecca Moore from Emeritus Professor Rebecca Moore from San Diego State University, for being such a great help in getting this book over the line. So I'll just start off with a quick introduction to the Hare Krishna movement, because I'm aware that there are, many people attending today aware of the Hare Krishna movement, but I'm also aware that there are some people who don't know so much about it. So I'd just like to give a quick introduction. So the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, usually referred to as ISKCON, was founded in 1966, or it's registered in 1966 in New York City by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, usually referred to as Prabhupada or Srila Prabhupada, his honorific title, who was an Indian renunciate who arrived in the US in 1965 to spread Krishna consciousness in the West at the instruction of his guru. So I'll just refer, briefly to Krishna consciousness as meditation on the deity Krishna. So it's a monotheistic religious tradition. And you see there a picture of Prabhupada chanting in Golden Gate Park in 1967 in San Francisco, the year after he established ISKCON. So ISKCON belongs to the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, which was established in West Bengal in India by the Indian Saint Chaitanya and his associates in the early 16th century. So there is this older tradition that the movement belongs to. So I'd also like to say something about the Hare Krishna movement and ISKCON, because these are two terms that are often used interchangeably. I've deliberately titled this book The Hare Krishna Movement rather than ISKCON. And that's to be more inclusive and to acknowledge that the Hare Krishna movement really is a rubric for an array of different Gaudiya Vaishnava groups. And I consider the most prominent of those to be ISKCON. Sometimes both terms are used interchangeably. I've tried to use the term Hare Krishna throughout the book just to be more inclusive of the various types of groups, because there has been a certain amount of defection, some schism, people joining different groups, so that those boundaries aren't always necessarily so clear-cut. So in the interest of being inclusive, I use the term Hare Krishna, but there are times when I do need to refer to ISKCON specifically when I'm speaking in an institutional sense. So that's why I'm using both terms, and it does depend on the context. So I guess one thing I really wanted to address from the beginning is whether the Hare Krishna movement or ISKCON is a new religious movement, because this book is in the new religious movement series in Elements Cambridge publications. So that's not an easy question to answer. Scholars quite often label it and categorize it as a new religious movement. ISKCON was founded in 1966. So in that sense, it could be considered new, but it is part of this older tradition that we talked about going back to the 16th century. So it's not necessarily an easy thing to categorize in terms of a new religious movement or not. I know members of the movement don't like being categorized as a new religious movement because they do see themselves as belonging to that older Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. But scholars certainly tend to place it in that category. So we can, one could, consider that it could have elements of both of those things, having those aspects of a new religious movement, but also belonging to that older tradition as well. So I just wanted to say something about my goals in writing this book, apart from the fact that I was asked to write it and it seemed like a good opportunity to publish. I really felt that after I sort of did some research, that an updated monograph on the movement was needed. It had been a number of years since we'd had a monograph that was dedicated to a just more general treatment of the movement. We have had a publication in 2021 called Branding Bhakti by Nicole Karapanagiotis, where she talks about specifically about preaching methods within the movement. But as far as a more general treatment, it had been a number of years since there was something. I also wanted it to be an update on the movement, related to the fact that there hadn't been a monograph for a number of years. And I also felt it was important to make reference to more recent scholarship, and also to acknowledge early career researchers who've been doing research from different disciplinary perspectives as well. I also felt it was important to be inclusive of some marginalized groups like women, and the LGBTQ community, for example. So I've made efforts to do that. And I wanted to take a more global focus because a lot of the scholarship on the movement has been based from the United States, from that perspective. And I can't say I completely met that aim, just for the fact that the book is a small book and there's only so much that I could cover. But I did try to approach the movement more from a global perspective and to put some focus onto other parts of the globe other than the United States, which is often what's been done in the scholarship. So I just wanted to talk about the theoretical lenses or theoretical frameworks that I've used, that I referred to before. So there are three main frameworks that I'm using to try to understand the movement and what's been going on since its inception and what's happening currently. So I use Rodney Stark's model of what allows a new religious movement to succeed, or on the other side of that, why does it fail? The framework of frame alignment and resource mobilization. So I'll be talking about those throughout. I talk about those throughout the book to try to understand what's going on in the movement. So first of all, Rodney Stark came up with 10 positions of what makes a religious movement succeed, or in the absence of that requirement, why would it fail? And there's 10 propositions. I don't talk about all of them in the book. I focus on a few, and just for time purposes, I won't talk about all of them now. I think there's one I refer to. But really key to this framework is the idea of tension with broader society. So Stark and Fink talk about this in terms of the degree of distinctiveness, separation, and antagonism between a religious group and the outside world. And so I think this framework is really useful for thinking about how and why the Hare Krishna movement has changed in its attitude to and its relationship with broader society. Now, one of the propositions that I will mention that he talked about is this idea of cultural continuity. And Stark says that new religious movements will succeed to the degree that they retain cultural continuity with the conventional faiths of their host culture. And I'll, nuance that a little bit later as well in terms of this cultural continuity. So he's clearly not saying to completely become like those conventional faiths, but to have some degree of cultural continuity there. Now, another framework that I use that's quite important is this idea of frame alignment. How how do people become and remain members of religious organizations? So we're talking here really about this agreement between individual interests, values, and beliefs and the social movement that they're in the process of joining or have joined, their activities, goals, and ideology. So this fit between the individual and the social movement that they've joined or in the process of joining or potentially going to join. Now, to define what we're talking about when we're talking about frames. So Irving Goffman, the famous sociologist, talked about frames in terms of patterns of thought or behavior. So it's quite simple. It's patterns of thought or behavior that people engage in. So some examples of frames in relation to the Hare Krishna movement would be the frame of Krishna consciousness, so being Krishna conscious, attempting to be Krishna conscious, which means to be conscious of Krishna. The frame of Vedic culture. Vanderberg and Nis talk about the frames of Vedic culture. The frame of being a Hindu movement. So these are all different frames that the movement or members of the movement can adopt, and I'll be talking more about that a little bit later. So I think the framework of frame alignment is very useful for explaining why the Hare Krishna movement's relationship with broader society and its demographic makeup have changed. So I talk about that in the book quite a bit. And the final framework that I use is resource mobilization. And this is really how a group secures control over the resources that they need for collective action. So what resources do they need to fulfill their mission? So in this case, the mission that was set by, the founder of the movement. Now, in the book, I have a whole section on institutional and community dynamics. I talk about, I have an introduction, I talk about beliefs and practices, I talk about institutional and community dynamics, and I talk about that in different ways. And Burke Rochford has talked quite a bit about this transition from a monastic movement to a congregation-based movement and this increasing Indian Hindu membership, and he talks about that in amongst other publications, Hare Krishna Transformed. I also talk about some other institutional and community dynamics, and the reason I say institutional and community is I'm acknowledging that the movement is more than just this institution of ISKCON or other institutions that people belong to, but there's a community aspect to the movement that goes beyond this hard institutional structure. So I talk about the nuanced and diverse nature of Hare Krishna communities. And I draw on Joseph O'Connell's concept of hard, medium, and soft institutions, which I think is really important for understanding the movement. So these hard institutions are like, for example, this corporate structure of ISKCON. Then you've got medium institutions, which is the relationships that devotees have with each other, these relationship networks. And then soft institutions are the means of worship and symbolic interactions that devotees engage in as part of their practice. I also talk about apostasy, defection, and schism. And I also talk about something that's I don't think is talked about enough, and it's this idea of believing without belonging, which is something that Grace Davey came up with, which some of you may have heard about, this idea that sometimes people have a particular religious belief without belonging to a religious organization. And even in that case, there may be some contact with the organization, but it's more informal, or there may be some relationship with other devotees, but without identifying with a particular religious organization like ISKCON. So I have some discussion around that as well. Now, I do talk quite a bit in the book about the changing relationship of the movement with broader society. And I talk about some current issues. And this is really based on my internet research, which has been necessary during COVID lockdowns. A lot of my research did become online. But it's a good source of information about what's going on for people. So I talk about online communities, the fact that many communities have moved online, what that means for the movement. The issue of female gurus, can women be gurus within the movement, is something that's been going on for a number of years, and is still quite a contentious issue at the moment, with one female guru having initiated and then a moratorium on that being placed while some issues and objections from certain parts of the leadership have been worked out. So that's an ongoing issue. I talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the movement and how that has changed the way the movement has carried out interactions with each other, the way they outreach to people, the way they hold festivals and different services. So I talk about that. I talk about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and what that has meant for relationships between Russian and Ukrainian devotees. I talk about LGBTQ communities within the Hare Krishna movement. And I talk about changing approaches to outreach and proselytization as well. So those are some of the current issues that I'm talking about. So I also have a chapter on issues, controversies, and challenges. So I talk about disputes with wider society and how those are, most often due to a lack of cultural continuity and frame alignment. So many disputes in the early years were external disputes, and legal disputes. So those were early disputes that had quite an impact on the movement. I also talk about internal issues in the movement. So some of them, this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but the issue of succession. So what happened after the founder died and who took over after religious leadership. So that's the subject of the other book that's coming out next year that Ace referred to before. Leader malfeasance, so misbehavior by certain members of the leadership, child abuse in the movements and ISKCON, particularly in their boarding schools, the marginalization of women, many theological disagreements, and one that's really ongoing that really has quite an online presence is the editing of Prabhupada's books. That's an ongoing issue as well. So changing proselytization methods has been quite important. It's still a big topic of discussion in some online forums from the 1960s to the 1980s. A lot of public congregational chanting, book distribution, collection of donations in exchange for distributing paraphernalia. From the 1990s, 2000 onward, we see more indirect approaches to preaching and aligning with broader trends in society. So food distribution, teaching yoga, meditation, and vegetarian cooking, attending festivals, and eco-villages. Also the straight edge movement that we saw predominantly in the United States and Europe. And Nicole Karapanagiotis talks about this change in proselytization in her book, Branding Bhakti, from 2021. So I also talk about recent shifts in alignment, so socio-political events, including the rise of social media, the COVID-19 pandemic, concerns around climate change, have all changed the landscape that the movement is operating within and forcing it really to pivot again in negotiating this relationship that it has with broader society. So I'll just talk about some of the conclusions that I've come to in the book, because people always want to know, what's your conclusion? What have you concluded? So I'll just talk about those that I feel are most prominent. So it's clear that there has been a changing alignment of the Hare Krishna movement with mainstream society, broader society. And in Stark's terms, Rodney Stark, there's been a shift from a high state of tension with broader society to a medium state of tension with society. Frames, I concluded that frames are really important for the movement's future. And, I've didn't come to that conclusion on my own. People like Vanderberg and Nis talk about this as well, that the frames that the movement chooses to adopt will be pivotal in determining what its future is. The challenge of adapting to a rapidly changing world, I think, is really important. The movement has done a lot to adapt to its external environment since its inception. And moving forward, that's going to continue to be a challenge that the movement faces. And how is it going to adapt to this rapidly changing world? So referring to Stark again, in terms of this tension with broader society, Stark says that offering a religious culture that sets the movement apart from the general, and he says, secular culture, and imposing strict moral standards while maintaining a medium level of tension with its surrounding environment. And he says being strict about that, strict about its moral standards and its values, but not being too strict. That's what he thinks is important for a new religious movement to succeed, or a religious movement to succeed. So I see that as being one of the challenges that the movement faces, is to negotiate that level of strictness that it wants to have in order to be able to attract newcomers. Dealing with internal disputes is an ongoing issue. Issues around leadership and authority, the position and role of women, the issue of female gurus that has not yet been resolved. It seemed like it was resolved and women were approved a couple of years ago, but then there were some objections. So now it's on hold again. So that is an issue that the movement needs to deal with. And one could argue that these internal issues could be a distraction to the carrying out the mission that the movement, the founder had set early on. So I really came to the conclusion that the longevity of the movement relies in part upon leadership addressing and transparently addressing issues of misconduct in their own ranks, consulting with stakeholders where people do feel like they're victims, especially in cases of victims of abuse, that it's important that the leadership transparently addresses those issues. And Stark talks about that as well, being important for a new religious movement to succeed, is to have strong leadership that will deal with issues that come up honestly and transparently. And resource mobilization is a key challenge because the way bringing together resources to carry out the mission's objectives, there's had to be some shift in that. And again, that's something that Burke has talked about quite a bit. So as I've talked about, this changing external environment is, I think, causing the movement to pivot yet again in how it mobilizes resources, not just financial, but also in terms of people, and to do that in such a way that it can survive and thrive in this rapidly changing environment. Now, one thing I also talk about in the conclusion is this idea of competing in the spiritual marketplace. And this is something that various scholars like Jeremy Corrett have talked about. So they talk about this idea of a spiritual marketplace, how people are taking different attitudes to their religion and their spirituality, the idea of not necessarily wanting to subscribe wholesale to a particular religious tradition, but taking bundles of components from different traditions and putting those together. And this is something that I do talk about, this idea that there has been this shift in proselytization methods, but the challenge there is to not lose sight of these core values and messages that sustain the religious mission that were established by the movement's founder, Prabhupada. So I talk about that at the end, of striking that balance, in competing in the spiritual marketplace, is not losing sight of those core values that were there from the beginning of the movement. So that's all I'll talk about today. That's a QR code if you want to take a look at the book, and I'll just maybe just ask Alan or Ace, if you've got actually I'll ask Alan if you can just put that link in the chat for people. Okay, so we'll just now have some any questions or comments that people have. I'll be interested to hear what people have to say.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Burt, for that fascinating presentation, great summary of the extent research and bringing us to a certain point, and yeah, great global summary of the issues. There are some great questions that you have provoked with your presentation. And so I'll start with this one from Man's Brew. In your assessment, what is the most difficult challenge that the movement faces at present?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, Mans. Yeah, I don't know if I can really pin it down to just one most difficult challenge. As I referred to in the end, I feel like there are a number of challenges. One of them is this idea of resource mobilization, because that has been such a huge issue for the movement, how it had to really pivot when it moved from a sort of temple-based movement where people were living in temples to a congregation-based movement. That pivot had to be made. And then the Indian Hindu community has been, a huge help in terms of resource mobilization, and that's a whole other issue as well. And I do talk about in the end how do those things come together, and the movement really needs to make some decisions about how they're going to use the spaces that they have. How are they going to use their temples? What's going to take place in the temples? What's going to take place in other spaces that are, non-temple spaces? There's a much more, I think, fluid idea around the use of resources and what's the place of the temple and other spaces that are not in the temple. So I do talk about decisions that need to be made in that sense. Where is the effort going to be put there? So because any religious organization needs to be able to mobilize resources in order to be able to continue with their mission. So I think that is a big one. I think the issue of frames is also a big challenge as well, because there are, I look at different conversations that go on online with different parts of the community and different ideas around what is the movement's mission, how it should be carried out, how should preaching, proselytization, how should that be done? And there are a lot of different ideas around that. You've got, for example, Krishna West, that was founded several years ago, and there have been, there still are different opinions around that and that particular approach to preaching. So there's a lot of difference of opinion about what is the best way to move forwards in terms of outreach. So I feel like that is another big issue. I also feel that leadership is, as I referred to towards the end, Rodney Stark talks about leadership dealing, having a strong leadership that deals honestly and transparently with the issues that face the movement. Even when there are cases of especially when there are cases of abuse that have happened, and there are many discussions going on about that online. So I think that is also another big challenge that the movement needs to address. It is discussed a lot online at the moment, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction about how some of those cases have been dealt with. So off the top of my head, I think those are sort of the three big ones. It's hard to really nail it down to one, but thanks for the question. I hope that's answered it for you.
Excellent, thank you. Let's follow up with, on a similar vein, there's a couple of questions that I'll put to you together. One is by Noah, another by Abhinanda. So the first is, can you comment on some of the ISKCON splinter groups, like Bangalore, ISKCON Bangalore, and the Ritvik movement? And then there's a question around, from Abhinanda, how you would precast. Do you have a precast for ISKCON, split to Indian Western segments, privatization, secularization, schisms, or defections? Those are quite negative sounding precasts. But yeah, if you can comment on the future in terms of in these areas of further cooperation, or a disintegration, or a splintering, how you see things emerging there.
Yeah, so I think Noah's question, I've got it in front of me, that was the one that was talking about splinter groups like ISKCON Bangalore and the Ritvik movement. So that I think that was the first question. So I think the approach that I would take to that really is, I know that these things are seen quite negatively, at least within ISKCON. And of course, you know, there have been some real world consequences in terms of control of temples, like ISKCON Bangalore, as well as other temples, the Long Island Temple in the United States, where members of the Ritvik movement who believe that Prabhupada is the only guru in ISKCON. So serious real world implications for, you know, the control and ownership of temples. Beyond that, I suppose I would say, regarding these different splinter groups, I know that they're often seen negatively. I would probably, just from a sociological point of view, I'd probably just take the approach that that a movement is going to proliferate in different ways, and it's not always necessarily possible to control how it's going to manifest in these different ways. So I would personally take the view that with these different groups, if the practice of the tradition, the manifestation of the, you know, Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition in a modern sense is going to carry on, I think it is going to happen in these different forms, because people are always going to have disagreements on how things should be done. Now, that's not to take away from the seriousness of some of these disputes over ownership of ISKCON temples, but as a separate issue to that, I don't necessarily see different splinter groups as necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes some of the ways in which that has manifested in terms of conflict between people in different groups, and that has, you know, manifested in very real ways at places like Rath Yatras, where there's even sometimes violence can erupt because of people distributing different literature that represents their group, and it can become quite adversarial. So I suppose that is the downside of it, and I wouldn't dispute that is problematic, but in terms of the movement proliferating in these different ways, I personally don't see a problem with that, although I know, you know, Prabhupada was very strong on the point of not leaving ISKCON. So for some members of ISKCON, it's really important to stay within institution and to not join other groups. So that's, yeah, sort of a nuanced answer I'm giving there. And Ace, can you just remind me what was the other question? It was Abhinanda. Was Abhinanda's question?
Abhinanda was asking about a prediction regarding the future of the the movement and put forth some different scenarios, a split to Indian and Western segments, further secularization. There's even an idea here of privatization, schisms, and defections.
Yeah, so
and I think you could, put the positive as an
right.
alternative as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because that's also something that I talk about in the conclusion of the book as well, because there has been this idea that you've got the Western membership of the movement, and then you've got the Indian Hindu membership, and it's often seen as being two parts of the movement, and how do they come together, and this idea that the Indian Hindu part has really sort of is now inhabiting those spaces in the temples, while Western devotees, and especially those who are trying to outreach to Westerners, have then moved into other spaces, like other preaching centers outside of the temples. So it's often seen as this sort of two different parts of the movement, and some dissatisfaction with that as well. On the one side, Westerners feeling that the Indian Hindu side of the movement has taken over the temples, and then on the other side, Indian Hindu membership feeling like they're being discriminated against and not appreciated. So what I talk about in the conclusion of the book is that I don't necessarily feel like those two things have to be in conflict with each other and diametrically opposed. And this is something that Vanderberg and Nis talk about, how they don't necessarily see those two things as diametrically opposed either. That this, getting back to this idea of resource mobilization, and how the Indian Hindu community did really help ISKCON make that transition in terms of mobilizing its resources, which is often seen as a negative thing, and it's forced the like this mission drift, this shift away from the mission set by Prabhupada to outreach to Westerners. They argue that this could be a blueprint for the movement of how to make these transitions in terms of resource mobilization, mobilizing those resources that are needed to continue with the mission. And I've also come to the conclusion that I think both of those communities can exist within the same movement. Maybe they'll inhabit different spaces, and like that's happening to some degree currently. And I think there doesn't need to be a competition in either or. So I feel that there is room for both those segments. And as far as schisms and defections, I mean, ultimately people need to make a decision about how they want to practice their religious tradition, who they want to associate with, how they want to get that association that they need to carry out their religious practice. And that goes to the nuanced nature of Hare Krishna communities that I talk about in the book, that it's not just as clear cut as being a member of ISKCON or not being a member of ISKCON, or now I've joined another group. I feel like there's room for some flexibility there, because people ultimately need to make the decision for themselves as to what works best for them in terms of their own spiritual practice. So this idea of schisms and defections, I suppose, is that view might be taken when one's thinking more on an institutional level, like you're a member of this particular religious organization, whereas a more fluid view would sort of allow that, okay, people are going to practice in the way and with whom they most feel comfortable. And I think given the amount of, there is quite a bit of trauma from different members of the movement, it would seem that people then have those choices on how they want to practice. So I know those things are often seen negatively in terms of schisms and defections, but I don't necessarily see that has to be, a negative thing, that people want to go and, practice with another group of people, or, practice in a particular space and not another one. I hope that does that address the question, Abhinanda? Hopefully.
So while we wait for Abhinanda, can we move on to another question? So Burke Roshad here has asked a question continuing with your theme of resource mobilization. Burke asks, can you speak about how shifts in resources has influenced frame alignment itself? For example, the growth of an immigrant Hindu congregation in the West and how the religious culture of ISKCON has begun to shift, or how the resources and influence of ISKCON India has shifted. It doesn't quite conclude there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm just okay, I'm just pulling that question up in front of me. Yeah, well, yeah, thanks for the question, Burke. I know that this has been a big focus for you in your work. So obviously this idea of, you know, as ISKCON shifted from a sort of temple ashram-based movement, and as people started to move out of the temples, start to have families, work outside, study, that forced a shift in the frames of ISKCON, and you know who's a member and who's not a member. And as you've talked about, Burke, that there was some kind of, you know, economic financial collapse within the movement as people did move out of the temples, and all that income that they were bringing in from book distribution and distribution of paraphernalia did lead to this financial collapse. So that brought about a change in you know frames in terms of, okay, who's a member of the movement, who's a member of ISKCON, who isn't a member. Because you know prior to that it was like, you know, you're only a devotee if you lived in the temple, and if you didn't then you were not, or you were fringy, you weren't a serious devotee. So that caused frame alignment, as well as there was an increasing householder component to the movement. So the movement was forced to move, of course. It's quite a complicated scenario, as you've talked about, because people moved out because the temples couldn't support them, but there was also the whole, you know, zonal acharya period and what was going on with the gurus. That was also part of that as well. So people moved out because they couldn't be supported in the lifestyle that they wanted to lead, for example, being a householder, but then that in turn sort of further exacerbated this financial collapse that was going on. And then, as you've also talked about, then there was this shift to relying more on the Indian Hindu congregations. And that was really catalyzed in some instances, for example, at Bhaktivedanta Manor in the United Kingdom, where there was this threat of closing down the temple because of complaints from the neighbors about all the traffic coming through, especially on Sundays. And so the congregation there was really mobilized to fight to save the temples. So then there was more of a Hindu frame was coming in there as well, and a much more of a, you know, attendance of people from, you know, who would identify as being Hindus to Bhaktivedanta Manor. And then we saw this also was happening in other parts of the world as well. I mean, that was very prominent what happened at the Manor, but then it was also happening in other parts of the world where there was a conscious decision to rely on the Indian Hindu community to support the temples. So that led some, like I know at the Manor, that really did lead to more of an identification of being a Hindu movement, and because of the, not just from a financial perspective, but also in terms of being seen as a legitimate religious tradition, because that was part of the fight. You know, that frame was used in fighting to keep the temple open at Bhaktivedanta Manor. And so this increasing frame of, you know, being, you know, part of the Hindu tradition. And again, that has sort of something that's been there in other parts of the world there, as well as the Manor. And so the growth of the immigrant Hindu congregation in the West and how the religious culture of ISKCON has begun to shift. Yeah, and I know that is something that you talked about. You talked about how there's a danger that the movement is moving away from the original mission set by Prabhupada, which was to give Krishna consciousness to Westerners. And so therefore you have initiatives like Krishna West for example, which is really aimed to take out what it sees as those sort of Indian cultural elements or Hindu elements from the from Krishna consciousness, and just to make it a more westernized version that people, Westerners, can relate to. So there has been a response to that, and in other, not just Krishna West, there have been other preaching initiatives. And again, I'll refer to Nicole Karapanagiotis. She talks about some of these outreach initiatives. So Radhanath Swami's projects, preaching projects that he's headed up, Dave Ramrita Swami with his loft preaching. So that has been a response to try to sort of, I guess, course correct back to this original mission that Prabhupada had sent of giving Krishna consciousness to Westerners. And so as far as the resources and the influence of ISKCON India, so yeah, we know that ISKCON in India has really become quite influential. ISKCON India has become quite influential, and but also within the movement, it has given it. ISKCON India has become more influential within ISKCON itself. I mean, prominent places of pilgrimage are in India, so it is quite central in that sense. Financially, economically, it's doing well, but it also gives ISKCON India some amount of influence over certain decisions, and we see that with the case of female gurus. There were objections from some of the leadership in ISKCON India about whether women could initiate, and for that reason, initiations by female gurus are actually on hold at the moment because of that. So there is that increasing influence there from ISKCON India. I don't know if that's addressed the issue for you sufficiently, Burke.
Thank you, Angela. I think we probably have room for one more comment. Ben Hyman has asked, related to your process for the writing of the book. Your researchers' informants appear to be within or close to ISKCON. Were informants from other Gaudiya maths or even practitioners outside the Gaudiya math range? For example, Nityananda Vamsa or caste Goswamis, Babajis involved to make the picture of a, quote, whole Hare Krishna movement more complete?
Right, yeah, great question. Thanks for that, Ben. I'm just trying to pull up the questions so I can have it in front of me. So yeah, as far as other Gaudiya Vaishnava groups is concerned, I have really focused mostly on, I have focused on ISKCON, and I've used the term Hare Krishna movement to try to be more inclusive. I have made reference to there being these other groups. Obviously, the scope of that is limited because of the size of the book. It's about a third of the size of a normal size book. So I haven't been able to really address that in this particular book, except making brief reference to it. But certainly a good point. I mean, in terms of taking a more inclusive approach, acknowledging the various modern Gaudiya Vaishnava groups that exist. Most of my research has been on ISKCON. I mean, I have focused on ISKCON in my research, but that is something that I can certainly, should really be thinking about the future to do some work on that as well. So I guess the main thing is just acknowledging all these different groups exist, and that there is this acknowledging, and I think respecting that there is this ability to move between different groups, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, a negative thing, as is often seen from within the institution of ISKCON. Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Angela, so much for your presentation today and for the discussion that it has provoked. Wonderful questions from our participants. Thank you all so much for being here and for engaging and for asking your questions. Please note this invited speaker series is ongoing, so there will be future events, the intersection of Hinduism and contemporary society. If there are particular scholars that you would like to hear from, that you would like to nominate as a presenter, please put their name forward. Our contact information is there on the OCHS website specifically for this project. And if you yourself have a project that you would like to share, let us know, because we really want this to be a forum for these types of discussions. It doesn't have to be specifically ISKCON related. That's the focus of Angela's work, but anything related to this intersection of Hinduism and contemporary society is the focus for this work, for this invited speaker series, conferences, and ongoing research as well. So please do continue to participate, and if you have ideas for other presenters, or you yourself would like to present, let us know as well. We will be posting the link for this presentation on our website. There were a few questions that we didn't get to address, and I apologize for that, due to limited time. Pale had a question that we didn't get to put forward, and then Abhinanda had many questions that we put forward, one of them. So thank you for your engagement, Abhinanda, particularly with all of your questions. Unfortunately, time is limited, so we couldn't get to all of those. But we are grateful for your presence and engagement. And we wish you well. Please stay tuned for further announcements for future invited speaking series events related to this project of the intersection of Hinduism and contemporary society. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.